There comes a moment in every man's life when he must stand alone against impossible odds, when everything he's learned, everything he's survived, comes down to one final test. For one mountain man in the Wyoming Territory, that moment arrived on a cold autumn morning when 6 outlaws decided he wasn't worth their respect. They saw a weathered old-timer with nothing but a small knife on his belt, easy prey in their eyes. Their laughter rang out across the valley as they surrounded him outside a remote trading post. But 20 years of surviving alone in the Rockies had taught this man lessons most folks never learn. What happened in the next 60 seconds would be told around campfires for generations. How does one man with a tiny blade defeat 6 armed desperados? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like so many others for Ezra Kane. He'd risen before dawn in his small cabin, tucked into a canyon 12 miles north of the trading post, built a fire against the September chill, and boiled coffee strong enough to strip paint. At 52 years old, his body carried the marks of 2 decades in the high country, weathered skin the color of old leather, hands scarred from skinning knives and frozen ropes, a slight hitch in his left knee from that winter he'd fallen through ice on Beaver Creek. But his eyes were clear and sharp as a hawk's, missing nothing, forgetting less. The ride down from his cabin took 3 hours through country that would kill a careless man in any season. Ezra knew every game trail, every water source, every place where the granite gave way to loose shale. His horse, a paint stallion he called Ghost for the way it moved silent through the timber, picked its way down the mountain with the confidence of an animal that trusted its rider completely. They'd been together 8 years now, longer than Ezra had been with most people in his life. McAllister's trading post sat in a broad valley where 2 creeks converged, surrounded by cottonwoods that turned gold this time of year. The building itself was rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney at one end sending up a thin line of smoke, a covered porch wrapped around the front, and there were usually a few horses tied to the rail. Today, Ezra counted 4, more than usual for a weekday morning. He dismounted slowly, feeling that knee protest, and tied Ghost to the far end of the rail where the horse could see the open country. The animal didn't like feeling hemmed in any more than Ezra did. On his belt, riding in a leather sheath he'd made himself, was the knife that would soon become the subject of stories told from Montana to Colorado. 4 inches of blade, maybe less, with a bone handle worn smooth from years of use. Nothing fancy, nothing that would draw attention. Just a tool like the man who carried it. The trading post door opened with its familiar creak, and Ezra stepped into the dim interior that smelled of coffee, tobacco, gun oil, and the 1,000 other scents that accumulated in a place where men bought supplies for hard living. Old man McAllister stood behind the counter, 70 if he was a day, with a beard like a snowdrift, and eyes that had seen the frontier when it was truly wild. "Ezra," McAllister said with a nod, the greeting of men who didn't need many words between them. "Quarterly run?" "Close enough," Ezra replied. "Need powder, coffee, salt. Could use some new rope if you've got any that's worth a damn." "Got some hemp came in last month. Good quality." McAllister reached under the counter and pulled out a coil, let Ezra inspect it with his hands and eyes. A man's life could depend on rope, and both of them knew it. While McAllister gathered the supplies, Ezra became aware of the other people in the store. 3 men lounged near the stove, watching him with the kind of attention that made the hair on his neck stand up. They wore trail dust and hard miles, guns riding low on their hips in a way that suggested frequent use. Their eyes held that flat, measuring look that predators got when sizing up prey. At the back of the store, near the shelves of canned goods, stood a young woman Ezra recognized as Sarah McAllister, the old man's granddaughter. She'd come out from St. Louis 2 years back after her mother died, chose to stay in this rough country rather than return to city life. She was maybe 25, with her grandmother's dark hair and her grandfather's steady gaze. Right now, that gaze was fixed on the 3 men by the stove, and Ezra could see the wariness in her posture. "Been some trouble through here?" McAllister said quietly, as he wrapped the supplies in brown paper and twine. "Gang hit a bank up in Cheyenne 3 days ago. Killed 2 lawmen getting away. Word is they're headed south toward Colorado, might be passing through this territory." Ezra nodded slowly, taking in this information the way he'd learned to assess weather patterns or animal sign. Trouble had a way of finding men, even men who rode far into the mountains to avoid it. He glanced again at the 3 strangers, saw how they watched Sarah when she moved, saw the way their hands never strayed far from their weapons. "These them?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Don't know," McAllister replied, "but I don't like the feel of it." The old man's instincts had kept him alive through Indian wars, claim jumpers, and 40 years of frontier trading. If he felt something was wrong, something was wrong. Ezra began recalculating his morning. He'd planned to get supplies and head back up the mountain, maybe stop at the creek to check his trap line. Now he found himself thinking about positions, angles, how fast he could move if he needed to. It was a way of thinking he'd tried to leave behind 20 years ago, when he'd pinned his marshal's badge on the desk in Abilene and walked away. He'd been 32 then, already old in ways that had nothing to do with years. He'd seen too much violence, too much of what men did to each other when law was just a word and might made right. The final straw had been coming home to find his wife Mary dead from childbed fever, the baby lost with her, dying alone because he'd been off chasing rustlers who weren't worth the bullets it took to stop them. He'd left everything, the badge, the town, the life he'd built, headed west into the mountains where a man could live by his own code, where the only laws were the ones nature wrote. For 20 years he'd kept to himself, trapping in winter, hunting in summer, coming down to McAllister's 4 times a year for the supplies he couldn't make himself. It was a simple life, a hard life, but it was his own. The knife on his belt had been Mary's last gift to him, ordered special from a knife maker in Kansas City. She'd given it to him the Christmas before she died, wrapped in red cloth with a note in her careful handwriting, for the man who makes his own way. She'd understood him even then, understood that he chafed against the confines of town life, that his soul needed open country the way other men needed whiskey or cards. Now that knife, small and unassuming as it was, represented everything he'd become. Not a lawman anymore, not a citizen of the territories, just a man who survived by skill and knowledge, who asked nothing from anyone and gave what he could when it was needed. "That'll be $8 even," McAllister said, pulling Ezra back to the present. Ezra counted out coins from a leather pouch, real money earned from pelts sold to traders who came through twice a year. He didn't deal in script or promises, only in things of actual value. As he gathered his supplies, he heard the door open behind him. 3 more men entered, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. These weren't drifters or cowpunchers looking for work. These were hard cases, the kind Ezra had arrested 100 times back when that was his job. They moved with the casual arrogance of men who'd decided the rules didn't apply to them, who'd discovered that violence opened doors and silenced objections. The man in front was tall and lean, with a face like a hatchet and eyes the color of dirty ice. He wore 2 pistols and carried himself like he knew how to use them. Behind him came 2 more, both thick through the shoulders, both watching the room with predatory awareness. "Well now," the tall man said, voice carrying across the store. "Looks like we got ourselves a gathering." Sarah moved closer to her grandfather. McAllister's hand drifted below the counter, where Ezra knew he kept a shotgun. The 3 men by the stove straightened up, suddenly alert and focused. And Ezra Kane, who'd come down the mountain for coffee and rope, found himself standing in the middle of something that was about to go very bad, very fast. The tall man's eyes fixed on Ezra, taking in the mountain man's worn clothes, the weathered face, the simple knife on his belt. A slow smile spread across the stranger's face. Not friendly, not warm. The smile of a man who'd found something amusing. "Look at this old-timer," he said to his companions, "out here in the wild country, armed with nothing but a pig sticker." The other men laughed, a sound like breaking glass. And Ezra Kane, who'd tried so hard to leave violence behind, felt the old instincts rising in him like a long, dormant river suddenly fed by spring melt. He knew what was coming, had known it from the moment these men walked in. Some things, it seemed, a man couldn't run far enough to escape. The tall man stepped further into the trading post, his boots heavy on the plank floor. Up close, Ezra could see the road dust on his clothes, the way his gun leather was worn smooth from use, the cold calculation in his eyes. This wasn't a drifter looking for work or a cowhand between ranches. This was a man who'd chosen a particular path in life, and that path was written in every deliberate movement he made. "Name's Cole Dalton," the man said, as if the name should mean something. "These are my associates." He gestured to the men flanking him, then to the 3 by the stove. "We've had a long ride, and we're in need of supplies. Lots of supplies." McAllister's voice was steady, despite the tension radiating through the room. "I can help you with that. Always happy to do business with paying customers." The emphasis on paying wasn't lost on anyone. Cole Dalton's smile widened, showing teeth that reminded Ezra of a wolf's grin. "Oh, we'll pay," he said. "Just maybe not in the currency you're used to." One of the men by the stove laughed, a sound that made Sarah take another step back toward the rear door. Ezra noticed her movement, noticed how Dalton's eyes tracked her like a hawk watching a rabbit. Every instinct honed over 30 years of reading dangerous men told him exactly where this was heading. "I think," Ezra said quietly, "the lady and I were just finishing our business. We'll get out of your way." Dalton's attention swung back to him, and Ezra felt the weight of that gaze. It was the look of a man deciding whether something was worth his time or whether it needed to be eliminated as an inconvenience. "Old man, I don't recall asking you to leave. In fact," he stepped closer, "I'm suddenly real curious about you." "Nothing curious about me," Ezra replied. "Just a trapper passing through." "That's so." Dalton's eyes dropped to the knife on Ezra's belt, and his grin turned mocking. "And you protect yourself with that little thing? Hell, I've seen women carrying bigger knives to peel potatoes." The other outlaws laughed on cue, but Ezra noticed they were spreading out now, moving into positions around the room. They'd done this before, knew how to box someone in, how to control space and eliminate options. These weren't amateur thugs. They were organized, disciplined in their own brutal way. "It does what I need it to do," Ezra said evenly. "I bet it does," Dalton replied. "Probably real good for skinning rabbits and whittling sticks." He turned to his men. "Boys, what do you think? Should we be scared of Grandpa here with his toothpick?" More laughter, louder now, meant to humiliate and intimidate. Ezra had heard it all before, back in his lawman days. Men like this fed on fear and weakness grew bold when they thought they had the upper hand. The trick was never to give them that satisfaction, never to show the fear even when it was there. "Look," McAllister said, trying to diffuse the situation. "There's no need for trouble. I've got supplies for everyone. Let's just conduct our business peaceful-like." Dalton whirled on him. "Shut your mouth, old man. We'll tell you when to talk." He grabbed a jar of preserves off the counter and smashed it on the floor, the glass and fruit exploding across the planks. "That's what I think of your business." Sarah gasped, and that small sound seemed to shift something in the room. Dalton's head turned toward her like a snake scenting prey. "Well now, what do we have here? Didn't notice you back there, darling. Why don't you come up front where we can get a proper look at you?" "Leave her alone," McAllister said, his voice harder now. His hand moved toward the shotgun under the counter. One of Dalton's men was faster, already moving around the counter with his pistol drawn. He slammed it down on McAllister's reaching hand, and the old man cried out in pain. Sarah screamed and started forward, but Ezra moved first, putting himself between her and the nearest outlaw. "Enough," Ezra said, and there was something in his voice now, something that came from years of facing down armed men in dusty streets, of standing alone against odds that should have killed him a dozen times over. "You want supplies? Take them. You want money? There's some in the register. But you leave these people alone." Dalton studied him with renewed interest. Well, Grandpa's got some bark after all. "Tell me, old-timer, you some kind of hero? That what this is? You gonna save the day with your letter opener there?" "I'm just saying there's no need for this. Take what you want and ride on. Nobody needs to get hurt." "See, that's where you're wrong." Dalton moved closer, close enough that Ezra could smell the whiskey and trail sweat on him. "Somebody does need to get hurt, because we've got a reputation to maintain, and part of that reputation is that nobody stands up to us, nobody tells us what to do. And anyone who tries," he poked Ezra's chest with one finger, "learns a very painful lesson." The wanted poster was tacked to the wall behind the counter. Ezra could see it from the corner of his eye. $5,000 for the Dalton gang, wanted for bank robbery and murder in Cheyenne. 2 lawmen killed, along with a bank clerk who'd tried to be a hero. These weren't men who could be reasoned with or talked down. They were killers who'd already crossed the line that separated the lawless from the truly evil. Ezra had known men like this before, had arrested some, killed others when there was no choice, and he'd learned that they respected only one thing: the credible threat of violence meeting their own. Words wouldn't work. Bargaining wouldn't work. The only language they understood was the language he'd tried so hard to leave behind in the mountains. "Outside," Dalton said suddenly. "Boys, bring him outside. I want room to work." 2 of the outlaws grabbed Ezra's arms, started to drag him toward the door. He didn't resist, just let himself be moved, his mind already working through what was coming. They wanted a spectacle, wanted to break him publicly as a message to anyone else who might think about standing up. That meant they'd need space, need an audience. That also meant they'd be overconfident. As they shoved him out onto the porch and down into the dirt clearing in front of the trading post, Ezra took stock of his surroundings. The hitching rail was 20 feet to his left. His horse, Ghost, stood at the far end, ears forward and alert. The trading post was at his back. Open ground spread out in front of him toward the creek, maybe 40 yards. Cottonwood trees lined the water, their golden leaves rustling in the morning breeze. 6 men formed a loose circle around him, all armed with pistols. Some had rifles slung across their backs. Dalton stood directly in front, his hand resting on his gun butt. Inside the trading post, Ezra could see McAllister and Sarah pressed against the window, watching with horrified eyes. "Here's how this works," Dalton announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're going to get on your knees and apologize for interfering in our business. Then you're going to crawl back to your horse and ride out of here. And if you do it real nice, real humble-like, maybe we'll let you keep that pitiful little knife of yours as a souvenir." The outlaws laughed, but it was different now. They were outside, spread out, and some of that easy confidence had shifted into something more watchful. Even predators got cautious when prey didn't run the way it was supposed to. Ezra stood still, feeling the weight of the knife on his belt. 4 inches of steel, sharp enough to shave with because he maintained it every day. Light enough to move fast, heavy enough to bite deep. Mary had chosen well all those years ago. She'd known him better than he knew himself sometimes. "I'm not getting on my knees," Ezra said quietly. "And I'm not crawling anywhere." Dalton's smile faded. "Then I guess we do this the hard way. Boys, teach this old fool some respect." The man nearest to Ezra's right stepped forward, drawing his pistol. "This is going to hurt, Grandpa." "Yes," Ezra agreed, his hand moving to his knife. "It is." But he didn't say who it was going to hurt. The morning air hung still and heavy, like the world itself was holding its breath. Somewhere a crow called from the cottonwoods. Ghost stamped one hoof, sensing the change in his rider's posture. And Ezra Kane, who'd spent 20 years trying to be something other than what he'd been, felt the old self rising up like muscle memory, smooth, certain, and utterly without mercy when mercy wasn't an option. The first outlaw lunged forward, confident in his gun and his numbers. He shouldn't have been. Cole Dalton's pistol came up fast, the barrel finding Ezra with practiced ease. The outlaw's finger squeezed the trigger, and time seemed to compress into that single instant before the hammer fell. Ezra had been shot at enough times to know the signs, the tightening of the shooter's shoulders, the slight adjustment of aim, the breath held for steadiness. He moved as the gun fired, dropping low along Ghost's neck and spurring the horse left. The bullet passed through the space where his chest had been a heartbeat before, close enough that he felt the heat of it, heard the angry wasp buzz of its passage. The shot that should have killed him instead clipped his shoulder, a burning line of pain that felt like someone had dragged a hot iron across his skin. But pain was just information, the body telling the mind it was damaged. Ezra had learned long ago how to acknowledge that information and keep moving anyway. He drove Ghost straight at Dalton, closing the distance before the outlaw could fire again, bringing him inside the effective range of the pistol. The knife flashed silver in the morning light, and Dalton threw up his gun arm to block. The blade bit through cloth and skin, opening a long gash across Dalton's forearm that sent the pistol spinning from suddenly nerveless fingers. The outlaw stumbled backward with a curse, clutching his arm, blood welling between his fingers. Ezra wheeled Ghost around to face the other 2 outlaws, but they were already separating, trying to flank him. Smart. These weren't the overconfident thugs who'd started this fight. They were survivors who'd learned to adapt. The stocky one with the scarred face moved to Ezra's left, while a younger man with mean eyes circled right. Both had their guns drawn now, but neither was firing. They'd seen what happened when you shot at a moving target from this range. They were waiting for a clear shot, for Ezra to make a mistake or Ghost to stumble. Patience in a gunfight often meant the difference between living and dying. Ezra kept Ghost moving in a tight circle, never giving them a stationary target, his eyes tracking both men simultaneously. His shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, and he could feel blood soaking through his shirt. The wound wasn't deep. The bullet had carved a furrow rather than punching through, but it was enough to weaken his right arm, to make every movement cost just a little more effort. Behind him, he heard Dalton scrambling to retrieve his fallen pistol with his offhand. 3 armed men, all experienced, all motivated. The math was getting worse by the second. Then Ghost's hoof caught on something, a depression in the ground, maybe one of the many gopher holes that dotted this valley, and the horse stumbled. Just for a second, just a half step off balance. But that was enough. The scarred outlaw fired, his shot catching Ezra in the meat of his thigh. The impact felt like being kicked by a mule, a stunning blow that momentarily whited out his vision. He felt himself slipping from the saddle, grabbed for the horn, but his blood-slicked hand couldn't find purchase. He hit the ground hard, the breath driven from his lungs, dirt filling his mouth and nose. His leg screamed pain at him, and when he tried to stand, it buckled. The bullet had punched clean through, which was good, nothing left inside to cause infection, but it had shredded muscle on its way, leaving that leg barely functional. Ghost reared and wheeled, putting himself between Ezra and the outlaws, protecting his fallen rider the way he'd been trained. The horse's hooves flashed, keeping the men back, buying Ezra precious seconds to gather himself. He rolled toward the water trough 20 feet away, dragging his wounded leg, knife still gripped tight in his right hand. Every instinct screamed at him to get behind cover, to create distance and reassess. The fight had turned, and not in his favor. A bullet splintered the wood above his head as he pressed against the trough. Another punched through the water-filled container, sending a stream spurting across the dusty ground. They had him pinned now, and they knew it. "Not so tough now, are you, old man?" The scarred outlaw's voice carried across the clearing, thick with satisfaction. "Thought you was something special with that knife, but you bleed just like everybody else." Ezra's breath came in ragged gasps, each one sending fresh waves of pain through his shoulder and leg. His hands were shaking from blood loss and adrenaline crash. The knife felt heavy now, harder to grip. He'd been in bad situations before, but this was pushing beyond bad into desperate. Inside the trading post, he could see McAllister pressed against the window, his old rifle in his hands. The proprietor was shouting something, but Ezra couldn't make out the words over the ringing in his ears. Then the trading post door swung open, and McAllister stepped out onto the porch, the rifle raised to his shoulder. The old man's hands were steady, steadier than they had any right to be for someone his age. Years of frontier living had taught him how to shoot, and more importantly, when to shoot. "That's enough," McAllister called out, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd made his decision and wouldn't be swayed from it. "You boys have had your fun. Now it's time to end this, before more people get hurt." Dalton, still clutching his wounded arm, let out a harsh laugh. "Old man, you pull that trigger and my boys will cut you down before you can work the bolt. You really want to die for this stranger?" "Ezra Kane ain't no stranger," McAllister replied. 3 years back, I was checking my trap line up near Copper Ridge. Got myself between a grizzly sow and her cubs. That bear would have killed me if Ezra hadn't come along. Put himself between us, gave me time to get clear. Could have been killed doing it, but he didn't hesitate. Ezra remembered that day. Remembered the sheer terror of facing 800 pounds of protective mother bear with nothing but a knife, and the knowledge that if he ran, McAllister was dead. He'd stood his ground, made himself the bigger threat, and when the bear finally charged, he'd managed to wound it enough to drive it off. Both he and the bear had survived that encounter, though Ezra had carried the scars for months afterward. "So yes," McAllister continued, "I reckon I do want to risk dying for him. Man who saves your life earns that kind of loyalty." Behind McAllister, Sarah appeared in the doorway, and Ezra's heart sank. She was holding a shotgun, an old double barrel that looked older than she was, and her hands were shaking, but her eyes were fierce. "And my father," Sarah said, her voice wavering but determined, "was Marshal James Corrigan of Cheyenne. He died 3 days ago stopping a bank robbery, shot in the back by cowards while he tried to protect innocent people. You think I'm going to let his killers walk away from here?" The color drained from Dalton's face. For the first time since this fight started, Ezra saw genuine fear in the outlaw's eyes. "That's right," Sarah continued, tears streaming down her face now, but her voice growing stronger. "I know who you are. All of you. The Dalton gang. The wanted posters are all over Cheyenne. And you murdered my father." The revelation hung in the air like thunder before a storm. Ezra's mind raced, reassessing everything. This wasn't just about supplies or intimidation anymore. This was personal. This was justice and revenge and grief all tangled together into something that would only end one way. Dalton's hand tightened on his recovered pistol, his calculation obvious. Witnesses couldn't be allowed to live. Not now. Not with this knowledge spoken aloud. Ezra pushed himself upright despite the screaming protest of his leg. He had to end this, had to finish what he'd started, because if he didn't, McAllister and Sarah were going to die trying to protect him. Some debts, it seemed, could only be paid in blood. The moment stretched taut as a bowstring, everyone frozen in their positions, like pieces on a chessboard, waiting for someone to make the move that would determine everything. Ezra could see the calculation happening in Dalton's eyes. How many people he'd have to kill, how fast he could do it, what his chances were of riding away from this valley alive. Ezra used the water trough for support, dragging himself fully upright. His leg barely held his weight, and the world tilted slightly as blood loss began to take its toll. But he kept the knife visible, kept his body positioned between the outlaws and the trading post. If shooting started, he'd be the first target. That would give McAllister and Sarah a chance, however slim. "You're that Marshal's daughter?" Dalton said, and something flickered across his face. Not quite regret, but perhaps an acknowledgement of complication. "James Corrigan. Good man, your daddy. Shame he had to be on the wrong side of things." "He was on the side of the law," Sarah replied, her voice steadier now. "The side of decency, something you wouldn't understand." "The law," Dalton spat the word like it tasted bad. "You know what the law is, girl. It's just rules made up by men with power to keep men without power in line. Your daddy enforced those rules, and it got him killed. That make him a hero or a fool?" Ezra saw Sarah's finger tighten on the shotgun trigger, saw the rage and grief warring in her expression. "Don't you dare," he said quietly, drawing her attention. "Don't let him make you into what he is." She met his eyes, and something in his steady gaze seemed to anchor her. Her finger eased off the trigger, though she kept the shotgun leveled. Dalton laughed, a bitter sound. "Listen to Grandpa, girl. He knows about the law, about what it costs." He turned his attention back to Ezra. "Don't you, old man? I can see it in you. You wore a badge once. Probably thought you were making a difference, serving justice and all that noble horse shit." Ezra said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. "Yeah," Dalton continued, warming to his subject. "I thought so. And where'd that get you? Alone in the mountains, hiding from the world. At least I'm honest about what I am. I take what I want. I don't pretend there's some higher purpose to it." "You're right about one thing," Ezra said quietly. "I wore a badge. In Kansas, then again in Abilene. Spent 10 years trying to bring order to towns that didn't want it. Lost my wife because I was never home, always chasing men like you instead of taking care of what mattered. He shifted his weight, testing his wounded leg. It held, barely. But you're wrong about why I'm in the mountains. I'm not hiding. I'm choosing. Choosing not to be the kind of man who defines himself by violence. Choosing a life that doesn't require me to kill or be killed. And yet here you are. Dalton gestured at the clearing, at the wounded men groaning in the dirt. Killing and being killed. So much for your choices. I didn't start this fight. No, but you sure as hell didn't walk away from it either. Could have just kept your mouth shut, got your supplies, rode back up your mountain. But you had to play hero. Had to prove you still had it in you. Dalton's smile was cruel. How's that working out for you? The truth of it stung worse than the bullet wounds. Ezra had inserted himself into a situation that didn't require his involvement. Could have stayed in his cabin, avoided the trading post for another month. Could have walked out when the outlaws arrived. Could have ridden away when Dalton offered him the chance. But he hadn't. And now people were in danger because of choices he'd made. In his vest pocket, the stopped watch pressed against his ribs. Mary had died because of his choices too, because he'd chosen to wear a badge, chosen to chase justice instead of being home where he belonged. The mountains had been his penance, his way of ensuring he'd never make choices that hurt innocent people again. Except here he was, making exactly those choices. Maybe you're right, Ezra said finally. Maybe I should have walked away. But I didn't. Can't change that now. So the question is, what happens next? Dalton considered this, his eyes never leaving Ezra's face. What happens next is you and your friends die. Can't let witnesses live, not after what the girl said. Nothing personal, just business. There's another option, Ezra said. You take your wounded and ride out. Leave these people alone. I won't follow, won't tell anyone which direction you went. And I'm supposed to trust the word of an ex-lawman? You're supposed to trust that I'm tired of killing, that I've seen enough blood for one lifetime. Ezra's voice carried the weight of 2 decades of mountain solitude, of nights spent remembering faces of men he'd killed in the name of justice. I just want to go back to my cabin and be left alone. You want to ride south to Colorado and disappear. Seems like we both get what we want. The scarred outlaw spoke up. Boss, we can't let them. Shut up, Dalton said sharply. I'm thinking. Ezra could see the calculation happening. Dalton was wounded, half his gang was down, and he was facing 3 armed people who'd already proven they wouldn't go down easy. Even if he won this fight, it would cost him. More wounds, maybe more dead men, definitely more attention from law enforcement. Or he could ride away, lick his wounds, live to rob another day. The medicine pouch hung from Ezra's belt, its beaded surface worn from years of carrying. A Shoshone elder named Grey Wolf had given it to him after Ezra helped the tribe through a harsh winter, sharing his supplies and knowledge of where game could be found. Inside were herbs that could fight infection, moss that could stop bleeding, remedies that had kept Ezra alive through injuries that should have killed him. He'd need those remedies today, if he survived the next 5 minutes. All right, Dalton said finally. We ride out. But old man, if I ever see you again, if you ever cross my path, I'll kill you on sight. No warning. No mercy. Fair enough, Ezra replied. Dalton gestured to his men. Get the wounded loaded up. We're leaving. But as the scarred outlaw turned to help one of the injured men, Ezra saw it. The subtle hand signal from Dalton, the way the younger outlaw's eyes flicked toward the trading post, towards Sarah. It was a setup. They were going to comply just long enough to get close. Then they'd strike, kill everyone, and ride away with no witnesses. Ezra's hand tightened on his knife. The fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The outlaws began moving toward their wounded companions, but Ezra kept his eyes on Dalton. In 30 years of facing down dangerous men, he'd learned to read the subtle tells, the way a man's shoulders tensed before violence, the flicker of eyes toward a target, the slight adjustment of weight that preceded sudden action. Dalton had all the tells of a man preparing to strike. "Hold on," Ezra said sharply. "Nobody moves until I see your guns on the ground." Dalton's smile was thin and cold. "Don't trust me, old-timer." "I don't trust anyone who rides with killers." "Smart man." Dalton's hand drifted toward his pistol. "But here's the thing. I'm done negotiating with you." He drew fast, bringing the gun up toward Sarah on the porch. But Ezra had been expecting it, was already moving despite the screaming protest of his wounded leg. He threw himself forward, covering the distance in 3 stumbling steps, and drove his shoulder into Dalton's midsection just as the gun fired. The shot went wide, punching splinters from the trading post's wall. They went down together in a tangle of limbs, Dalton trying to bring the gun around for another shot, Ezra trying to reach the outlaw's throat with his knife. They rolled across the dirt, each seeking advantage, both wounded and desperate. Ezra's knife found fabric and flesh, opening a gash across Dalton's ribs. The outlaw gasped, and his grip on the pistol loosened. Ezra struck the gun away, sent it spinning across the clearing. Then they were grappling hand to hand, Dalton's superior size and strength against Ezra's skill and desperation. The other 2 outlaws started towards them, but McAllister's rifle cracked, and a bullet kicked dirt at the scarred man's feet. "Stay right there," the old proprietor called out. "Next one goes through your chest." Ezra managed to pin Dalton beneath him, the knife pressed against the outlaw's throat. Both men were gasping for breath, covered in dirt and blood. For a moment, Ezra could end it. One quick thrust and cold Dalton would never hurt anyone again. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the look in Dalton's eyes. Not fear, but resignation, as if he'd always known it would end like this. Or maybe it was Ezra's own exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness of violence that had driven him to the mountains in the first place. "It's over," Ezra said quietly. "Done. You understand?" Dalton's laugh was bitter and wet with pain. "It's never over for men like us." Then Ezra felt it, something hard pressing against Dalton's chest under his shirt. Not a weapon. Something else. Something that shouldn't be there. His free hand moved to investigate, pulled open Dalton's shirt, and froze. Pinned to the outlaw's undershirt, dulled with age but unmistakable, was a marshal's badge. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Ezra stared at the badge, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. "You're a lawman." Dalton's face twisted into something between a grimace and a smile. "Was. Past tense. Just like you." "No." Ezra's voice was hollow. "No, you're an outlaw, a murderer. You killed Sarah's father." "I killed my partner," Dalton said, and there was something almost like regret in his voice. "James Corrigan was a good man, best lawman I ever knew, and that's exactly why he had to die." Sarah's anguished cry came from the porch. "What are you talking about? My father was your partner. You—" Her voice broke. "You killed him." Ezra climbed off Dalton, but kept the knife ready, kept himself between the outlaw and the trading post. "Explain." "Now." Dalton sat up slowly, one hand pressed to the wound in his ribs, blood seeping between his fingers. "I was Marshal of Cheyenne for 8 years. Good reputation, clean record. Your father," he looked at Sarah, Was my deputy for the last 3. We worked together, trusted each other. He was like a brother to me. Then why? Sarah couldn't finish the question. Money, Dalton said simply. The usual reason men turn bad. I started taking payoffs from the cattle barons, looking the other way when their hired guns terrorized homesteaders. Small stuff at first, then bigger. Then I realized I was in so deep there was no getting out. He coughed, spat blood. James figured it out. Found my ledger, saw how much money I was taking. Confronted me about it. Said he was going to the territorial marshal, was going to see me hang for what I'd done. So you killed him, McAllister said, from the porch, his voice thick with disgust. So I killed him, Dalton agreed. Made it look like he died stopping a bank robbery. Hell, I even robbed the bank to make it convincing. Recruited some men I knew from my law enforcement days. Crooked deputies. Prisoners I'd helped escape. Formed a gang. Ezra felt sick. The bank payroll. You robbed your own department. Seemed fitting. They'd been paying me under the table for years. Figured I'd take one last big payment on my way out. Dalton's eyes were distant, remembering. James died not knowing his partner pulled the trigger. I made sure of that. Let him think it was the bank robbers who shot him. Didn't want his last moments to be. He stopped, swallowed hard. Didn't want him to know I'd betrayed him. Sarah made a sound like a wounded animal. She started down from the porch, the shotgun shaking in her hands, her face streaked with tears. You murdered my father, your partner, your friend. For money? For survival, Dalton corrected. If James had talked, I would have hanged. So yes, I killed him. And I've killed 7 more men since then, anyone who got too close to the truth. That's what you do when you cross the line, girl. You keep crossing it until there's nothing left but blood and running. Ezra thought about the badge in his own past, the one he'd set on the desk in Abilene, and walked away from. He'd been so close to becoming what Dalton had become. The corruption had been there, the offers of money to look the other way, the temptation to use his authority for personal gain. He'd seen other lawmen fall to it, had watched good men become the very thing they'd sworn to fight. But he'd walked away, had chosen the mountains and isolation over continuing down that path, and Dalton had chosen differently. You know what the real joke is, Dalton said, looking at Ezra with something almost like kinship. You and me, we're the same. Both wore the badge. Both got sick of what it cost us. You ran to the mountains. I ran into crime. Different choices, same reason. We couldn't stomach being lawmen anymore. We're nothing alike, Ezra said. But even as he spoke, he felt the uncomfortable truth of it. They were alike. 2 men who'd broken under the weight of violence and corruption, who'd chosen escape over continuing to fight. The only difference was the direction they'd run. Sarah reached them, the shotgun now pointed directly at Dalton's chest. Her finger was on the trigger, and her eyes held murder. You took everything from me. My father. My future. My family. I know, Dalton said quietly. And I'm sorry for that if it matters. James was a good man. Better than either of us. He glanced at Ezra. Deserve to be judged by. It doesn't matter, Sarah said. Sorry doesn't bring him back. No, Dalton agreed. Nothing brings them back. I learned that a long time ago. Ezra put his hand gently on the shotgun barrel, pushing it down. Sarah, don't. You kill him like this. In cold blood, you'll never be free of it. Trust me on that. I've killed men who needed killing, and I still see their faces when I close my eyes. He murdered my father, I know, and he'll face justice for it. Real justice, a trial, a rope. The whole territory will know what he did. Ezra met Dalton's eyes. "Isn't that right? You're done running." Dalton laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "You think I'll face a trial? I'm a wanted man. Soon as we get to any town with a lawman, they'll either hang me on the spot or I'll die trying to escape. Either way, I'm dead." "Maybe," Ezra said, "but you'll die known for what you really are. Not as some romantic outlaw, but as a corrupt marshal who killed his own partner. That badge you're wearing, everyone will know what you did while wearing it. That's the justice Sarah deserves." For a long moment, Dalton stared at him. Then something seemed to break in the outlaw's face, and he nodded slowly. "All right. You win, old man. Take me in. Let them hang me proper. Just—" He looked at Sarah. "Just let me say one thing. Your father talked about you all the time. How proud he was. How smart you were. How you'd chosen to come out here and help your grandfather instead of staying in the city where life was easy. He loved you more than anything in the world." Sarah's face crumpled, and she turned away, shoulders shaking with sobs. McAllister came down from the porch to hold her, shooting a look of pure hatred at Dalton. Ezra felt the weight of it all pressing down on him. The violence, the betrayal, the corruption that had poisoned everything the badge was supposed to stand for. This was why he'd left. This was what he'd been running from. Not just the violence, but the way it twisted good men into something unrecognizable. And now he was standing in the middle of it again, bleeding and exhausted, and wondering if 20 years in the mountains had changed anything at all. The badge on Dalton's chest caught the morning light, and Ezra had to look away. Some symbols lost all meaning when the men wearing them stopped believing in what they represented. The revelation hung heavy in the morning air, transforming everything that had come before. The outlaws weren't just criminals. They were corrupt lawmen. The badge Dalton wore wasn't a trophy or disguise. It was his genuine authority, perverted and twisted into something obscene. Ezra's shoulder and leg throbbed with each heartbeat, and he could feel fresh blood soaking through his makeshift bandages. He needed to sit down, needed medical attention, needed rest. But the situation was far from resolved. 3 outlaws lay wounded in the clearing, including Dalton. 2 more stood warily off to the side, their hands visible but still dangerous. Any moment of inattention could turn deadly. "McAllister," Ezra called out, not taking his eyes off the outlaws. "You got rope in that trading post?" "I do. Heavy stock rope should hold." "Bring it out. We're going to tie these men up proper, then send someone to the nearest town for the territorial marshal." One of the standing outlaws, the younger one with mean eyes, laughed harshly. "You really think we're just going to let you tie us up? Old man, you can barely stand. Your friends are a girl and an old-timer. We're professional killers. You do the math." He was right, and Ezra knew it. The temporary détente created by shock and revelation was already crumbling. These men were cornered and desperate, the most dangerous kind of prey. They had nothing to lose and everything to gain by fighting their way out. "You could run," Ezra said quietly. "Take your horses and ride. Leave Dalton behind to face what's coming to him. You two might make it to Mexico, might disappear. Better than dying here." The 2 men exchanged glances. For a moment, Ezra thought they might actually consider it. Then the scarred one shook his head. "We ride together or not at all. That's the code." "Honor among corrupt lawmen?" McAllister's voice was bitter as he emerged from the trading post with coiled rope. "That's rich." "Call it what you want," the scarred man replied. "But Cole took care of us when nobody else would. We ain't abandoning him now." Dalton, still sitting in the dirt with his hand pressed to his wounded side, looked up at his men with something almost like gratitude. Boys, I appreciate the loyalty, but the old man's right. You should run while you can. This is my debt to pay." "Shut up, Cole," the younger outlaw said. "We're getting out of this together." Ezra saw it coming a second before it happened, the younger man's hand dropping toward his gun, the subtle shift in posture. He threw himself forward, ignoring the shriek of protest from his wounded leg, and tackled the outlaw before the gun could clear leather. They went down hard, and Ezra's knife found the man's gun hand, opening it to the bone. The younger man screamed and dropped the weapon. The scarred outlaw was drawing his own gun when McAllister's rifle barked, the shot taking the man in the shoulder and spinning him around. The outlaw's gun fired as he fell, the bullet going wild, and then he was down and clutching his wound. Ghost, who'd been standing guard nearby, suddenly reared and bolted toward the tree line, spooked by the gunfire. Ezra's heart sank. Without the horse, his options were even more limited. He couldn't run, couldn't pursue, couldn't escape if this went bad. Sarah still stood on the porch, the shotgun leveled, but her hands shaking so badly, Ezra worried she might drop it. She was holding together through sheer force of will, but trauma and shock were taking their toll. How much more could she endure before breaking? Dalton used the distraction to grab his fallen pistol. In one smooth motion, he rolled to his feet and backed toward the hitching rail where the outlaw's horses stood. His gun swept across the clearing, covering everyone. "I changed my mind about surrendering," he said, his voice tight with pain but steady with purpose. "I've thought about it, and I'd rather die out here than dance on the end of a rope while citizens throw rotten fruit at me." "Cole, don't be stupid," Ezra said. "You're wounded. You won't make it a mile before you pass out from blood loss. Maybe. But at least I'll die on my own terms." Dalton grabbed the reins of the nearest horse, a big bay gelding. "I'm taking this horse and riding out. Anyone tries to stop me gets shot. That's my final offer." "You'll just go hurt more people," Sarah said from the porch, her voice cracking. "Kill more innocent men like my father." "Probably," Dalton agreed. "But that's not your problem anymore. You wanted justice for your daddy? Take it from these boys here." He gestured to his wounded men with the gun. "They all helped with the bank robbery. They're all guilty. String them up if it makes you feel better." The scarred outlaw's eyes went wide. "Cole, you can't just—" "I can and I am." Dalton was already pulling himself into the saddle, teeth gritted against the pain. "You all signed up for this life, knowing how it might end. Well, today's your day. Me, I'm riding out." Ezra realized with cold certainty what was happening. Dalton was sacrificing his men to buy himself escape time. There was no loyalty, no honor, just raw survival instinct. Whatever genuine regret he'd shown about killing Sarah's father, it wasn't enough to make him face the consequences. But as Dalton wheeled the horse toward the open country, something emerged from the tree line. Ghost came thundering back, but the horse wasn't alone. Riding low on its back was— no, not riding. Someone was hanging on to the horse's mane, being dragged along. No, not dragged. Running alongside, the figure resolved as it approached. It was a Shoshone man, older, his weathered face marked with the signs of a hard life lived close to the land. Grey Wolf, the elder who'd given Ezra the medicine pouch years ago. He must have been hunting in the area, heard the gunfire, and come to investigate. But more importantly, he wasn't alone. Behind him came a dozen Shoshone warriors, armed with rifles and bows, their faces painted for war. Dalton pulled his horse up short, suddenly facing a new threat. The warriors spread out in a semicircle, cutting off his escape route. Grey Wolf approached slowly, his eyes taking in the scene. The wounded men, the blood-soaked clearing, Ezra struggling to stay upright. "My friend," Grey Wolf said in English, speaking to Ezra. You are hurt. I've been better, Ezra admitted. These men, they're wanted for murder. They killed a marshal in Cheyenne. Grey Wolf's expression darkened. He turned to regard Dalton with the kind of cold assessment that transcended language or culture. It was the look of an elder who'd seen men like this before, who knew evil when he encountered it. This one, Grey Wolf gestured at Dalton, has darkness in his eyes. I have seen such men before. They bring death wherever they ride. That's about the size of it, McAllister agreed from the porch. Dalton's gun swung toward the warriors, but his hand was shaking now, blood loss and shock catching up with him. Stay back, he warned. I'll shoot the first man who comes closer. No, Grey Wolf said calmly. You will not. You are wounded and weak. You cannot fight us all. You can die here, fighting, or you can surrender and face your people's justice. Choose. For a long moment, Dalton sat there on the horse, gun raised, calculating his odds. Ezra could see the desperation in his eyes, the trapped animal fear of a man who'd run out of options. The warriors waited patiently, their weapons ready but not threatening. They'd let him make the choice. Finally, Dalton's shoulders sagged, the gun lowered. I surrender, he said quietly. I'm done. Grey Wolf gestured, and two warriors moved forward to take Dalton from the horse. They handled him firmly, but without unnecessary roughness, binding his hands with rawhide cord that would hold better than any rope. The other wounded outlaws were similarly secured, their weapons confiscated and piled in the center of the clearing. Ezra felt his legs give out and sat down hard in the dirt. Now that the immediate danger had passed, the adrenaline was draining away, leaving only pain and exhaustion in its wake. Sarah rushed from the porch to his side, pressing cloth torn from her skirt against his leg wound. You need a doctor, she said, her voice shaking. You're losing too much blood. I'll live, Ezra replied, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. The world was starting to blur at the edges, and sound seemed to come from very far away. Grey Wolf knelt beside him, opening the medicine pouch at Ezra's belt. This I gave you for such times. Now I will show you how to use it properly. His hands moved with practiced skill, packing Ezra's wounds with herbs and moss, binding them with strips of leather. The pain was immediate and intense, but Ezra could feel the bleeding slow. You helped my people survive a hard winter, Grey Wolf said as he worked. Shared your supplies when you had little to spare. Taught us where to find game when the deer had moved to lower country. Now I help you. This is balance. This is right. McAllister came over with whiskey from his store, offered it to Ezra. For the pain and shock, drink. Ezra drank, felt the burn spreading through his chest, warming him from the inside. The world was still tilting dangerously, but the herbs were working, stabilizing him. He'd live. Probably. Dalton, now bound and guarded by warriors, watched this with an unreadable expression. You've got friends, he said to Ezra. People who care what happens to you. When did I lose that? When did it all go wrong? When you chose yourself over your oath, Ezra replied. When you put money ahead of justice. When you killed your partner to protect your secrets. Yeah, Dalton said softly. Yeah, I suppose that's about right. Sarah stood and walked over to face Dalton directly. Her shotgun was gone, left on the porch, but she held herself with dignity and strength. My father's last words, she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks, were, tell Sarah I love her. The deputy who was with him when he died told me that. He thought my father was talking about the bank robbers when he said it. But now I wonder, did he know? In those final moments, did he realize it was you who betrayed him? Dalton's face crumpled. No, I made sure of that. He died thinking I was his friend. Then you're a coward, Sarah said. Not just for killing him, but for not having the courage to let him know the truth. You robbed him of that knowledge, robbed him of the chance to understand what happened. That's almost worse than the murder itself. She turned away from Dalton, done with him, walked back to where McAllister stood, and let her grandfather wrap his arms around her. And Ezra, watching them, felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that isolation wasn't strength, that pushing people away didn't protect them. Sometimes, the only way to protect people was to stand with them, to be present, to accept that connection meant risk, but also meant having someone to bind your wounds and hold you up when you couldn't stand alone. The mountains had taught him how to survive. But maybe these people could teach him how to live, if he survived the next few hours. Ezra drifted in darkness for a time he couldn't measure. Sometimes he heard voices, Sarah's soft murmurs, McAllister's gruff reassurances, Grey Wolf's steady chanting in Shoshone. Sometimes he felt hands tending his wounds, applying fresh herbs, changing bandages. Sometimes there was pain so intense it dragged him toward consciousness, only to have the herbs pull him back down into healing sleep. When he finally opened his eyes, the light was different, softer, filtered through cloth. He was lying on something comfortable, not the hard ground. The ceiling above him was the rough-hewn logs of the trading post's back room, where McAllister kept his private quarters. Someone had moved him inside, cleaned him up, and tended his wounds properly. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it, as pain lanced through his shoulder and leg. A hand pressed gently on his chest, easing him back down. Sarah's face swam into focus above him, her expression a mixture of relief and concern. "Easy," she said. "You've been unconscious for nearly a day. The Shoshone healer said you lost a lot of blood. You need to rest." "The Outlaws," Ezra managed, his voice rough and dry. "Secured. Grey Wolf and his warriors are keeping watch. The territorial marshal is on his way from Laramie. Should be here by tomorrow morning." She held a cup of water to his lips, and he drank gratefully. "Dalton?" "Alive. Talking. Seems he's decided to confess everything. The bank robbery, the murders, all of it. Says he's tired of running, tired of being what he became." Sarah's voice was flat, emotionless. "I don't know if I believe him. Don't know if it matters." Ezra studied her face, saw the exhaustion there, the grief still raw but beginning to be processed. "Your father would be proud of you. You held yourself together when it mattered. Didn't let fear or revenge control you." "I wanted to kill him," Sarah admitted quietly. "When I learned the truth, I wanted to pull that trigger so badly. If you hadn't stopped me, but I did stop you, and you listened. That takes more strength than pulling a trigger ever could." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "My grandfather told me about your wife, about what happened 20 years ago. I'm sorry." Ezra's hand moved automatically to his vest pocket, feeling for the stopped watch. Someone had removed his bloody clothes and dressed him in a clean shirt, but they'd left the watch on the table beside the bed. He picked it up, looked at the frozen hands. 3:47. Forever and always. "Mary believed in second chances," he said softly. "Believed. People could change, could become better than they were. I've spent 20 years in the mountains wondering if she was right about me, wondering if I could ever be the man she thought I was." "And now?" Sarah asked. "Now I think maybe change isn't about running away from who you were. It's about choosing, every day to be better than you were yesterday. I came down from that mountain this morning, expecting a simple supply run. Instead, I got—" he gestured vaguely, encompassing everything that had happened. All of this. Do you regret it? Getting involved? Ezra thought about that. No. I regret that violence was necessary. I regret that people got hurt. But I don't regret standing up when it mattered. That's the difference between me and Dalton. He wore a badge and forgot what it meant. I took mine off because I remembered exactly what it meant. The door opened and McAllister entered, carrying a tray with food. Simple fare, bread and broth and coffee. You're awake. Good. Thought we might have to bury you for a while there. Takes more than a few bullet holes to kill me, Ezra said, attempting lightness he didn't quite feel. Your horse is fine, by the way. Grey Wolf's people are tending him. And that knife of yours. McAllister nodded toward the table where Ezra's small, bone-handled blade lay, cleaned and sharpened. That little thing has caused quite a stir. The warriors are calling you man who fights with small blade. Apparently that's a compliment in Shoshone culture. Means you have great skill. Ezra looked at the knife, the weapon that had been Mary's final gift to him. It had done everything she'd believed it could. Not because it was special, but because it was wielded with purpose and skill. The Outlaws had laughed at it, right up until they learned that size meant nothing compared to the will and ability of the person holding it. It's just a tool, Ezra said. Nothing more, nothing less. Maybe, McAllister replied. But it's also a reminder. Some things don't need to be big or flashy to be effective. They just need to be sharp and in the right hands. Sarah helped Ezra sit up enough to eat, spooning broth into his mouth when his hands shook too badly to manage it himself. The food was simple but good, and he could feel strength beginning to seep back into his muscles. Outside, he could hear the sounds of the valley returning to normal. Birds calling, the creek flowing, wind rustling through the cottonwoods. The violence had passed, leaving scars but not destroying what mattered. The land endured. The people endured. Life continued, stubborn and resilient. Dalton and his men would face justice. Sarah would have closure, or as close to it as anyone could get after losing a father. McAllister would rebuild what had been damaged, and Ezra would heal. And then he'd have to decide what came next. The mountains still called to him, offering solitude and peace. But so did this place, these people, this connection he'd fought so hard to avoid for 20 years. Maybe, he thought, it was time to stop running. Maybe it was time to choose to stay. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation at the trading post, and autumn had settled fully into the valley. The cottonwoods had gone from gold to bare branches, and the first serious frost had touched the high country, warning of winter's approach. Ezra's wounds had healed cleanly, leaving scars that would fade with time, but never quite disappear. His shoulder was stiff in the mornings, and his leg ached when the weather changed, but he could walk without limping now, could mount his horse without help. The territorial marshal had come as promised, along with a deputy and a representative from the territorial governor's office. They'd taken statements from everyone, documented the scene, and removed the prisoners. Cole Dalton and his surviving gang members would stand trial in Cheyenne, facing charges of murder, bank robbery, corruption, and a dozen other crimes. The story had spread quickly through the territory. A corrupt marshal brought down by a mountain man with a small knife and a group of Shoshone warriors. Already it was being embellished, turned into the kind of tale that would be told in saloons and around campfires for years to come. Ezra found the attention uncomfortable. He'd given his statement and then retreated to McAllister's back room, avoiding the curious looks and questions from travelers who'd heard the story and wanted to see the man for themselves. But eventually the interest died down, the lawmen departed with their prisoners, and the valley returned to its normal rhythms. Sarah had been the one to sit with him through the worst of the healing, changing his bandages and making sure he ate and rested. She'd been surprisingly good at it, her hands steady and her manner calm, as if caring for the wounded came naturally to her. They'd talked during those long hours about her father, about her life in St. Louis before coming west, about the choice she'd made to stay with her grandfather instead of returning to the city. "I thought about going back," she admitted one evening as she wrapped fresh bandages around his shoulder. "After father died. Thought maybe I'd made a mistake coming out here, that the frontier was too dangerous, too unpredictable. But then I realized danger is everywhere. Violence is everywhere. The difference is whether you face it alongside people you care about or alone in a city where no one knows your name." "Your father understood that," Ezra said. "He chose to stand for something, even knowing the cost. That's not a mistake. That's courage." Now, as Ezra sat on the trading post porch, watching the morning sun paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold, he thought about those words. About courage and choice and the difference between running from something and choosing to live differently. The mountains still called to him. They always would. The high country with its silence and solitude was part of who he was, stamped into his soul after 20 years of living close to the land. But he was learning that solitude and isolation weren't the same thing, that a man could choose quiet without choosing to be alone. McAllister emerged from the trading post with 2 cups of coffee, handed one to Ezra, and settled into the chair beside him. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the valley wake up, listening to the creek and the wind and the distant call of a hawk hunting its breakfast. "Been thinking," McAllister said eventually, in the way of a man who'd given a matter considerable thought and come to a decision. "I'm not getting any younger. Could use some help around here, especially with supply runs up into the high country. Someone who knows the territory, knows how to survive up there." Ezra sipped his coffee, let the old man continue. "Pay wouldn't be much, room and board, share of the profits. But it'd be steady work, honest work, and you could still spend time up in your cabin when you needed to. Wouldn't have to give up the mountains, just share them a little." "Share them," Ezra repeated, tasting the words. "Sarah's planning to stay on permanent," McAllister continued. "Help me run the place. She's got a good head for business, and folks like her. Having her here has brought in more customers, travelers who appreciate a woman's touch in a place like this. She's even talking about starting a lending library, bringing books out for folks who live too far from town to get them otherwise." Ezra looked at the old man, saw the hope there carefully concealed behind casual words. McAllister had been alone for a long time, too, running this trading post by himself, making do with occasional visits from his granddaughter. Now he had family here, had a chance to build something more than just a business, and he was offering Ezra a place in that building. "I'll need to go back up to the cabin," Ezra said slowly. "Check on things, prepare it for winter. Might stay up there for a few weeks, make sure everything's secured proper." McAllister nodded, understanding. "Of course. Mountain's still yours. Always will be. Just saying there's a place here, too, if you want it." "I'll think on it," Ezra said, which they both knew meant yes, but said in the way of men who didn't like to make things too simple. Sarah came out then, carrying a basket of fresh-baked bread that filled the air with warmth and the smell of home. She'd recovered her spirits over the past weeks, the grief still there, but softened by time, and the knowledge that justice was being served. She'd received a letter from the territorial governor, thanking her for her courage and informing her that her father would be honored posthumously for his years of service. "I made extra," she said, offering the basket to Ezra. "Thought you might want some for your ride back up to the cabin." "Appreciate it," Ezra said, accepting the bread. The small gesture touched him more than he could easily express. The thoughtfulness of it, the assumption that he'd be back, that this wasn't goodbye but simply, "See you soon." He stood slowly, testing his leg, and found it held his weight well enough. Ghost was already saddled and waiting by the hitching rail, the horse having enjoyed 3 weeks of McAllister's good hay and oats. The tomahawk was strapped to the saddle again, and the small bone-handled knife rode in its sheath on his belt, cleaned, sharpened, and ready. But now, when Ezra looked at the knife, he didn't see just a tool or a weapon. He saw Mary's faith in him, her belief that he could make his own way in the world. He saw 20 years of survival and learning and growing. He saw the moment when 6 outlaws had laughed at it, and the moment when they'd learned their mistake. Size didn't matter. Show didn't matter. What mattered was purpose, skill, and the courage to use what you had when it was needed most. McAllister walked him to his horse, and they shook hands in the way of men who'd been through something together and come out the other side changed but intact. Sarah hung back on the porch, but she raised one hand in farewell, and Ezra touched his hat to her. "You'll be back?" McAllister asked, though it wasn't really a question. "I'll be back," Ezra confirmed. "Give me a month to settle things up there. Then we can talk about your offer more serious-like." "Fair enough." Ezra swung into the saddle, feeling the familiar comfort of good leather and a horse that knew him. He turned Ghost toward the mountains, toward the high country where his cabin waited. But for the first time in 20 years, he didn't feel like he was running to the mountains. He was simply going home to get his affairs in order before coming back down to what was beginning to feel like another kind of home. The pocket watch pressed against his chest still stopped at 3:47. He took it out, looked at it one final time, and then, after a moment's hesitation, wound the stem. The watch began ticking, the hands moving forward from that frozen moment, finally continuing the journey they'd paused 20 years ago. Mary would have approved, he thought. She'd always believed in moving forward, in choosing life over grief, in finding the strength to keep going, even when the road was hard. He'd spent 2 decades honoring her memory by stopping, by freezing himself in that moment of loss. But maybe the real way to honor her was to live, fully, completely, connected to the people and places that mattered. He tucked the watch back into his pocket, feeling its steady tick against his heart, and urged Ghost forward. Behind him, the trading post grew smaller, but it was still visible when he turned to look back from the first ridge. McAllister and Sarah still stood there, watching him go, and Ezra raised his hand one more time before the trees swallowed him. Fuantiaho mountains rose before him, magnificent and eternal, and he rode toward them with the autumn sun on his face and the knowledge that he was no longer running from anything. He was simply a man who'd learned that strength came in many forms, in small knives wielded with skill, in quiet men who stood when standing mattered, in the courage to let people in after years of keeping them out. The story would be told and retold in the years to come, growing with each telling. The mountain man who faced down 6 armed outlaws with nothing but a tiny knife and showed them all what true skill looked like. But Ezra wouldn't be there to hear those tellings. He'd be up in the mountains he loved, or down in the valley, helping friends he'd chosen, living a life that balanced solitude with connection, strength with vulnerability, the past with the future. And that, he thought, as Ghost carried him up the familiar trail toward home, was exactly how it should be. The knife on his belt caught the morning light one last time, 4 inches of steel that had proven more than enough. More than enough to defend what mattered. More than enough to remind a man that he was still capable, still useful, still worthy of the life he'd been given. Just like Ezra Kane himself, scarred, weathered. Not as young as he used to be, but still sharp where it counted, still able to do what needed doing when the moment called for it. And that was all any man could ask for.